welcome to everybody here. I'm always pleased to be able to share the history that I've collected over the years. About 35 years I've been collecting rural history, talking with people, and when I first started out, if I was talking to a very elderly person and they were interested in history and remembered what their grandparents told them, I was getting stories that were not in any history books like from the 1850s and 1860s. And so I've got some wonderful human history that from the farming area, because that's what I'm interested in, the rural history. Other people do the towns and the politics, and I stick out in the countryside. So today I'm going to talk with you about cheese factories that were dotted throughout the townships, and then Ian will talk about the dairies that process the milk when the cheese factories closed. And has everybody got a handout? So I'll be referring to some of the pictures on the back at some point. So if we take ourselves back to the 1830s, 40s, 50s, pioneer days, the pioneer families only had a few cows, just enough for their families and their family use. And the women would make cheese, and up in the Middleville Museum, if nobody's been up to the Middleville Museum, you must go sometime because it's a marvelous museum. Anyway, they've got this old cheese press that is about this round, and it's either a hollowed bit of a log, or it's a kind of a barrel thing with staves. I don't quite remember, but there are holes punched in the bottom, and there's a lid that fits on the top. And what they would do, they put the curd that they had made, the women had made, and then they put rocks on the top, and just kept adding rocks, and it would press the whey out the bottom, and that's how they made their homemade cheese. The women also churned butter, and they would put aside enough for the winter because the cows were not milked all year round. Back at the time, they dried off in the fall, and they would be going to have another calf in the spring when they would freshen or be ready to be milked again. And so they had to be sure to have the cheese and the butter last until the winter. And then sometimes I guess there'd be one cow kept that they would be milking, but most of their small herd would be dried off. So then, moving on, 50s, 60s, more and more fields were getting cleared, and people started to have more and more dairy cattle. And the herds were growing, and so there was an excess of milk. They had more than they needed for their family. And this was a sound that was heard on every farm. And that's so they could keep track of where the lead cow was. And then I think bells were on cows, not just back then. Cowbells have been used for a long time. So then the first cheese factories were opened in the 1870s. There's all this excess milk, and we thought we've got to process it and be able to sell it on, and make the cheese. And so the cheese factories were set up as a kind of cooperative. People would buy shares, and they were called patrons or patrons. And the cheese factories were vitally important at this time, in the 1870s and then on, because there was no other way for people to get actual cash money. And so the cheese factories, so many people have told me over the years, the cheese factories were a great boon because they were the first thing that put cash money in our pockets. And so a lot of mortgages were paid off with the milk checks. Then the cheese factories were dotted every 4 to 5 miles all around the countryside, because with the constraints of having to take the milk every day, and in a horse and wagon, a horse and buggy, so you could only go so far, and no refrigeration, so the cheese factories could not be very far apart. I'm going to mention a few of the cheese factories that were around this area. Not all of them. I don't know them all. There are fantastic maps that show all the cheese factories. CF, all the way through it. But I did go through them all to get them. But in the Almonte district, there were factories at Almonte, Pakenham, Cedar Hill, Fitzroy Harbor. Then there was the Rosebank factory in Blakeney, and the Mississippi Pride factory in Lecky's Corners. And it was, the very first one at Lecky's Corners was a log building right on Wolf Brook Road. There was a spring, and just up, I think it was just beside the old kirk. And then it burned. A lot of cheese factories burned because they were, it was steam, and so the boilers, just a lot of wood was burned in the cheese factories, and a lot of cheese factories succumbed to fire. So anyway, the first Lecky's Corners Mississippi Pride burned in 1907, and it was set up again in the tannery building that's in Lecky's Corners. And it was a tannery. It's a private home now, but it was a cheese factory. And on the back of the sheet, I just thought it might be interesting for people from the area to see the list of family names from the Appleton Cheese Factory. Further out in the country, people took their milk to factories in Clayton, Middleville, Hopetown, Tatlock, Halls Mills, and the Rosedale Cheese Factory was at Union Hall. It was Rosebank in and Rosedale at Union Hall. And the Union Hall Cheese Factory was one of the very first in the whole area. It was opened in 1874. And the people in the Rosetta area also took their milk to the Union Hall. In the very, very early days of the cheese factories, everybody got paid for the weight of their milk, which was not fair because some people said, okay, they're going to weigh my cans, I think I'll just add a bit of water. And so that made for it was called watering your milk. And so those unscrupulous folks made it very unfair for the people who had good cattle and good quality milk. So in 1888, the Ontario government passed a law saying that watering milk was a serious crime. And then in the early 1900s, they came up with a test for the butterfat content. And so from then on, the cheesemaker had to take a sample of everybody's milk, and it was tested for the butterfat content, and so then you were paid by the weight. Doing some kind of formula for weight and butterfat content. So it was much fairer to most farm families who had good cattle and good rich milk. Now there was a lot to be done in a cheese factory day. An assistant was needed, and often that was the cheesemaker's wife. Two for the price of one, sort of like the minister's wife did a lot of the work for the church. The cheesemaker's wife certainly worked hard too. So as a result, quite a few children grew up in cheese factories. One man told me that he grew up in a cheese vat, an old cheese vat, so they were using it as a playpen. And so the cheesemakers were up early in the morning. The first thing they had to do was fire up the boiler. Then they greeted the patrons as they came. They had to weigh in all the milk cans and dip out a little testing sample into a little bottle, which was then labeled. And then they added a preservative tablet to it. And this preservative tablet was very poisonous. Well, none of this milk in these little testing bottles was ever used. But I'm saying it's poisonous because there's more than one case where some child who's running around the cheese factory ate one of those tablets and got very, very ill. So testing the farmer's milk was another job they had to do, and recording all that. So he's doing all of that and making all the records and filling out the forms. So then the milk was all poured into the vat, and a starter was added. It was rennet. Sometimes it was called the pup. And so they added the pup and salt, and then the whole thing was heated by a boiler. And it was stirred with wooden paddles until it was thick. Then they cut it up. They had big cheese knives. They cut it up into curd, not small curds like we eat, but I think it was larger slabs of curd. And then it was packed into hoops. Hoops were kind of a container for the curd. And then these hoops were put into a press, and the whey was pressed out. Now, on the sheet that I gave you, the corner that you see an old log building on the corner one, and there's a thing underneath the logs, the corner of the logs. I was at an old farm, and I noticed that this old building had this thing under they were just holding up the corner that was starting to deteriorate. And the person said, "Oh, that's an old cheese press thing." And so that would have been one of the things that went into the end of each of the hoops. And I think they put in about 7 or 8 hoops in this long trench of some sort. And then there was a jack screw that was put on the end, and so it would just be tightened up. And the curd was left in there for 15 hours under 20 tons of pressure. So you can see why that thing is so hefty. So then each cheese, after all of the whey was pressed out, and I guess there was a trough underneath this, so there were holes, so that as this press was pressing these cheeses, the whey would run out the bottom too. And each cheese weighed 80 or 90 pounds. There were 80 and 90 pound ones, and there were also 10-pound cheeses. So that it would be taken out of the hoops and bandaged, which meant it was wrapped in cheesecloth, and put in the curing room. And I guess the curing rooms in the cheese factories were odoriferous places. They could smell very high, especially summer months. They didn't make cheese in the winter months, and so it was the warmth. And so the curing rooms were very high, even though they wiped the shelves down all the time with either vinegar or formaldehyde to try and keep it down. But as one man told me, he said, some days it would cut the nose right off your face. When the cheeses were cured, then they were waxed and labeled. And the factory name, the VAT number, and the date were put into on the wax. And all of this was another job for the cheesemakers, and it was very time-consuming, all done by hand. Till later years, of course, when they got some kind of a roller thing, and they could just roll the cheese along, and there was ink on the date things. And it's a really descriptive day. I never saw one. Someone told me about that. But in the spring of 1901, there was a cheesemaker who must have had just a bit of spare time, because he folded a note into a cheese, and it got shipped off, and he was hoping to hear where it ended up. And by the end of the year, he got a letter back from a man in Scotland, and that's where the cheese had gone. This is not a cheese box, but cheese boxes look exactly like this. So just to give us, we were thinking that this is probably would have been a 50-pound cheese. And the cheese box factories, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but we'll go there. So the cheeses were shipped out in these wooden cheese boxes, and the boxes were made. There was a cheese box factory near Hopetown on the Clyde River, and that was the Richardson Cheese Box Factory, and there was a cheese box factory in Carleton Place, and I think there was one in Almonte. Have you ever come across? But I'm not sure. And in around 1910 to 1914, each cheese box would have cost 10 cents. And so the huge loads of cheese boxes would be delivered to the cheese factories on those wing rack wagons. So you can think of a big hay wagon, and instead of the sides going up like this, the sides went out sideways, and then you just pile in lots and lots of cheese boxes and deliver them to the factories. So wagon loads of cheese were taken to Almonte, to the railway depot there. And the patrons were the ones who took turns. The schedule set up, and this is our turn to take a load of the cheeses to the railway. And their children loved, that was the highlight for them, to get on that wagon and go get for an adventure with their dad to take the cheeses. Now, are there any questions as they go along? Any I try to answer or comments or anything? Yeah.
Claudia, are we talking one kind of cheese, or would they make a variety of different kinds?
Especially the cheddar.
Mostly
Cheddar, yeah. I don't think they got into fancy things. Now, I could be wrong, but I've never heard of them making anything else but cheddar. And then I know that all the cheese that went overseas for World War I, especially, cheddar.
Yeah.
Top quality cheddar. Like it was Canadian cheese, had a very fine reputation. In fact, it had such a fine reputation that what American cheesemakers would do, because they weren't as popular, their brand was not as appreciated, they would ship their cheese into Canada and then ship it out, same product to Canada. Sound familiar? So, we'll go back to the whey for a minute. The whey that was pressed out of the cheese curds was drained out of the vat where the curds had been cut up, plus it was also drained out of the press thing. And all of the farmers would have empty milk cans, and instead of going home with an empty milk can, what they would take whey. And so the whey was, some of it may have been pumped for them to, but a lot of it was gravity fed. It's a big whey tank, and they would fill up their can and go home with it. They would feed it to the pigs, or some people made whey butter. And of course some would get spilled around the whey tank, and I guess the flies and the smell was tremendous. And what was it? In 1902, the Board of Health was notifying all the cheese factories to take care of this, take measures to prevent this terrible smell. In one case, whey was used to prevent a disaster. On a farm, they were having a threshing bee, and the men were sitting around at noon after they had their big dinner, and somebody noticed that there was a smoke coming out of by the eaves trough on the roof. And there were 2 whey cans there that hadn't been emptied yet, and so they took these cans and threw this whey up to put out the fire, because they figured it must have been maybe a cigarette butt that got into a burn nest or some leaves or whatever. Well, they grabbed these whey cans and put out the fire, which was great. But the comment of the woman remembering this told me, she said, "And didn't all the flies in the neighborhood love that?" And the smell lasted until the winter. So the cheese factories began to close in the 1950s, 1960s. Health regulations became more stringent, building standards were changed, and it just didn't pay to build a new factory with all the newly required machines and whatever. And also it was getting harder and harder to get a cheesemaker. So there were a lot of factors that, and also dairies, you guys. paid higher prices than the cheese factories. So there were several factors that led to the demise of the cheese factories. So that's an overview of how they worked and some of the stories about the whey and all that kind of stuff. But now I've got a bunch of other facts and stories. If I can just wait if there's any other questions about the operation of the cheese factories.
I noticed there's only one woman listed on the cheese factory baking list. So they were saying women were responsible for making cheese. They've been quite involved. But this, what would this patron list be doing?
Those are the people who brought their milk to the factory.
So
There's
she's a female farmer.
So there
there's
must have
only
been a
one
farmer.
female farmer, and
Well, she may have been a widow, she may have been, she may have owned the farm, a sister, who knows, they lived, but yeah. I hadn't even noticed that. So, some of the little stories and things. In September 1892, as many as 14 cheese factories combined their cheese to make one huge wheel of cheese, the Mammoth cheese. And it was to go to the Chicago World Fair, 1892. This cheese was 6 feet high and 28 feet in circumference, and it weighed 11 tons. So, all those cheese factories got together, made this big, huge cheese. I can't imagine what kind of a cheese press they had it in. I don't know those little details. But, so they kept it over the winter, it was curing it and all that, and was going to head down to the Chicago World's Fair, and it went down by train. So in 1893, it was shipped, and I guess it went out of Perth, and they had a big parade, and they had, it was in a big cheese box, and people signed their names and all this good luck to this cheese, because it was an exhibit, plus it was a competition for cheeses there. So this 11-ton cheese gets loaded onto the railway car, flatbed, and off it goes. And it was put on display on the 2nd floor.
oh,
And it immediately fell through the floor at the Chicago World's Fair. There's still a little piece of that cheese in the Perth Museum. I can't imagine what it looks like, this little ratty little thing, I don't know. But after the fair, it was shipped to England, and of course it was on the ship, and salt and rain, and I don't know, but it was pretty wrecked when it got there. But they found that if they sliced off, a lot of it was still fine cheese inside. And so then how this little piece got back to Canada, I don't know, but if you want to see a little old piece of cheese, go to the Perth Museum. People could buy cheese at the cheese factory. And you could buy a 10, a 40 pound, 90 pound, 50 pound, and it was also sold in smaller quantities. And the fellow, well, either his wife or the cheesemaker they used a stove wire, 2 wooden handles, and they would cut it with that to slice off however much you might want. Now, drinking was a serious problem for cheesemakers, and for many cheesemakers. Too many people were stopped in to buy cheese and chat and have a little nip. And so I guess cheesemakers, I don't know, there must be a lot of pressure making cheese too, so maybe it was a stress drinking, I don't know. But it turned out that a lot of women, because their husbands were the cheesemaker and they had a drinking problem, the women filled in and could make cheese as well as their husbands. Another issue that came up with cheese factories caused quite major connections in the communities. It was the decision because cheese was not made on Sunday. And so at some point they realized, well, they thought, every Monday, Saturday's milk is kind of getting a little sour. And so they, the quality of the cheese was not good for the Monday cheese making. And so many cheese makers decided that they would make cheese 7 days a week. Well, that was just scandalous, considered scandalous by many, many people, because you just didn't do anything on Sunday. And they're selling their soul for the sake of $1, and some cheesemakers refused. They wanted to keep the Lord's Day, that was it. But this was to decide to make cheese 7 days a week was a major shift in society. Doesn't sound like much, but it was one of those markers, like, oh, that was before Kennedy was shot, or that was before whatever. Well, this was what I heard a lot. Oh, well, that would have been before they made cheese on Sunday. And it was a marker in time, It's interesting. And it took years for that conflict to settle out in the communities. Actually, I'm about to tell you about another cheese factory, and this again is almost like it was a religion thing. In Boyd settlement, there were 2 cheese factories this back 1890s, right? And one of them was called Fair Play, and one of them was called Grab All. So you can see right away there's conflict there. And there was such hard feelings for that in the community between these 2 groups. And finally, in 1892, they did combine their patron list and their machinery and all. But there was the holiness movement, or the Hornerite group. There was a settlement of them near Boyd. And so I'm only wondering, was there, I think they were a fairly strict religious group, and maybe the others were just not as strict. I don't know. But anyway, Fair Play and Grab All. That was another example of dissent in the community. So now we'll go to World War II. Thousands and thousands of pounds of Canadian cheddar were sent overseas for the war effort. In Rosemary Sarsfield's, she's got a new book out about Clayton, and in it, so that was World War II. Then she's mentioning something in World War I, that in 1915, the Rosedale cheese factory patrons, that's Union Hall, donated a day's milk a week for months. And the cheese that was made from those, the different cheeses, was sold, and the proceeds were given to the Red Cross. So that was a community effort for the troops. Then the cheese-making year, I kind of referred to it a bit, was from May until late November, when the cows were dried off. So they didn't milk around the year like we do now. But of course, once the cheese factories closed, the cheesemakers were out of work for the whole till May, when the cows got out on the grass and could start producing milk again. So they had to, some of them had farms, some of them went to work in the bush, some of them worked in the town, and it was not a really good profession to keep you going the whole year. You had to have other work. Then in the 1940s, more and more people began to milk year-round, but the cheese factories were closed in the winter, and the reason it was is because it was just too cold. These cheese factories were just boards. They weren't insulated. There was an insulated room for the cheeses, but not for the working and for the whole back system and everything. So then in the winter, the cans of milk would be picked up by truck and brought into Producer's Dairy or some other dairy. Now, there's a picture there underneath the cheese factory in the back, and it's a milk house. And in there was many of them had a tank and a pump, and the water would be pumped into there, and the milk cans would be kept cool in there. And then there was always a platform with a big arm, with a pulley and a hook, or no, not a hook, we didn't clamp, because on each side of the milk can there were places to put this clamp, and they would wind it up, and then they could swing this arm out onto a kind of a stoop, and then the wagon would come along, and they could swing the milk can out onto there, because they were very heavy. It's like if you think of some big milk can like that full of water, well, this is heavy, so.
With 32 gallons.
Beg pardon?
With 32 gallons. So that's 320 minutes.
Yeah, that's heavy. So these
30 gallons.
milk houses were very, very neat kind of places. I've been in a few of them. They're getting fewer and fewer and fewer, like all of the farm buildings. But, so now I've got one last story, my favorite. This is about a Roma, or a gypsy woman, who went into the Rosedale cheese factory, and she wanted to buy some cheese. And it was around 1920 or so. And she asked the cost of a 90-pound cheese, and the cheesemaker says to her, well, if you can carry it, you can have it. Didn't she pick it up, put it on her shoulder, and she was going to walk out, and he had to very quickly say much more politely, it costs this much. So, that's my last little anecdote about cheese factories for today. Now, I'll take any questions or comments if you have any experience with them, but I'll just draw your attention to two of my books. This is by Word of Mouth, which is a series of articles that were in Lanark era. They're all Christmas, winter related kinds of things. So if you're looking for somebody who's Christmas present for somebody who's interested in local history, there's that one. And then my very favorite of all my books is my Barnes of Lanark County. So if anybody's interested in that, I'll be glad to sign for you later. And so Ian's going to tell us about dairies. I'll just take a couple of minutes if anybody's got comments. They want to share memories about it. You sound like maybe you know how much the cans weighed.
We used to go pick milk to IXL, Scotch Farms.
Right.
And went around to the back and filled the cans up my home with the way to feed the pigs. So I remember helping, what was his name? Don. Yeah.
It's a load that had it for Paul.
Yeah, what was his first name?
Can't tell.
Anyway, we used to help him. At least it looked like I was helping him. Took the cans into the scale and stuff. And that weighed it. Yeah.
So it took the two of them to lift them up.
Well, it was on the crank like you spoke of. He steadied the can as he went.
Right. And it had all those little bottles and stuff.
Yeah, you take a sample of
Take
it.
a little sample, yeah. Quite a production, quite a.
Did you have to wash the cans after that?
Yeah, we did there.
When you got them home?
But yeah, we don't put it in the tank.
Yeah.
And wash the tank. But in '62, my brother was in the hospital and things were really tough. And that was getting $1.50 hundredweight for milk at IXL. So we started bringing it to the producers area here. Time we get another few cents out of it.
$2.30 a hundred.
I'm not sure what he was getting.
So it became worthwhile to drive it here from
Well, it
IXL?
was on one way or the other, so it was closer down on it.
Okay.
But I guess at the cheese factories, if you mentioned what pork was, so they kind of got a payment, I understood, a basic payment, and then as the cheese was sold in the fall, there could be some, depending on the quality of the cheese, the quality of your cheese maker, when you got a higher price for your cheese and basic, so you get a bonus.
You get dividends at the end of the year for the quality that you had.
I understand that.
Yeah, there are still quite a few of the reports the cheese factory reports that the museum and using to Maryland, that tell how many thousands of pounds were made that year and the price and all that. And yeah, then the farmers got a big check at the end of, into November, yeah, just in time for Christmas.
Well, I don't know how big it was.
Big pardon?
I'm not sure how big it was, but it was everything you think today, it's so
Yeah.
well received.
I've got a story. It's related to butter. Used to be part of, when you ship your milk to the cheese factory, you get 10 pounds of butter. I don't know, you have to pay for it, I guess, but it got delivered. Now, I don't personally remember this, but this was a family story that apparently one hot summer's day, our butter was delivered to our house and left on the veranda. And the veranda had all these fancy little holes in it. So my two sisters and I apparently filled all these holes with butter. And the first thing my mother knew was when the dog ran by and it was all covered in grease where we wiped our hands. I think we went to the woodshed.
Yeah.
That was very bad. Because it was worth it.
And you wiped your hands on the dog, that's great.
Yes, I wondered if you can expand on like the cooperative model for these cheese factories. They're probably each a little bit different in how they ran anyways. But like would there be a group of the patrons who would act, I guess you could say, as a board and would choose or try to find a cheesemaker and whatnot? Like, was it operated in that kind of a way?
I think they did hire their own cheesemaker, you two might know that they hired their own cheesemaker, and there was a board, yes. And now, what I was wondering as I was writing this up and thinking about it, I don't know whether the patrons had to buy a share in the, you had to buy, so you did. So it was that aspect.
A lot of factories that were owned by the patrons.
Totally owned by the patrons, and so so then the building,
They had a committee or a board or whatever.
and so who owned the building and the land? Yeah, this is,
That's kind of where I was going to get to, but I'm sure it was probably different for every single situation.
But I know the one down on Clark Road where my wife comes from, it's Clark, was the name of the cheesemaker, and it was owned by a conglomerate.
where
On
was,
my father-in-law's property,
where was that? Your
Clark
property?
Road, near Rump's store.
Okay.
There's a big brick house.
Yes?
One little story, I was down in Upper County Village one day, and I had a whole thing myself to do what I wanted, so I went to the cheese factory, and the fellow was giving me this story. He said they had to buy, of course, they have to buy the milk. Can't buy raw milk, but to do it, they have to buy processed milk and have it ready. But anyway, he said we added 2% of salt to our cheese. Now he says you've got a taste for St. Albert's cheese. It's the salt. They got 4% salt.
Oh.
That was his story on it.
St. Albert, by the way, is a cooperative to this day. So I don't know what other cheese factories, whether they are or not. I know that Gay Lee has purchased the Black River down in Prince Edward County. Gay Lee also owns Ivanhoe, which is north of Belleville. And then Mapledale, which is north of Belleville, between Belleville and Tweed, which is one of my favorites, by the way. Ownership is unknown to me. I don't see any evidence of it being a cooperative, and I don't see any evidence of it being a corporate thing. So, maybe the next time I'm in there, I'll ask.
Yeah.
Figure it out. So,
Where does the cheese come from in Plum Hollow there, something, Smith Falls?
Plum Hollow?
Plum Hollow, there's a sign up I drove by, Plum Hollow Cheese Factory,
Yeah, that's
cheese products or something.
yeah, Forfar has the same sign.
Yeah.
And those are coming from, probably from artisan cheesemakers, like, what is it, Back 40?
That's what we just mentioned,
St. Albert's?
St. Albert's bought the quotas from Forfar, I know that.
Well, they did, eh?
So, that's been my guess that they put cheese back in there, but.
It could be.
That's what it is, I guess.
Yeah. So,
Can I ask, about, you mentioned the little bottles with the preservatives, what were those for exactly?
That was so to test for the butterfat.
Why did they put preservatives in it? Did someone come check it somehow?
So the milk would keep, the sample would keep for, maybe they did their test every 10 days, 5 days. And the sample was, you didn't have to keep it cool,
Right,
you just keep it in the bottle.
and did someone come
Just
check
a
it
little wee,
though?
I've seen them, they're little, kind of pink filling copies in.
Huh. Yes, and there were people that came around, the milk inspector.
Because the milk now, right around now, that I just picked up is tested in milk. Now, the milk now is tested in
Oh, yeah.
your milk.
Yeah, I mean, I went DHI,
I don't think
I don't think DHI has been, they were Pilsen or something else.
No, the last two cheese factories that were operating in Lanark County were Boyd, the one that had the conflict. It burned in the 70s, and then of course Balderston was going and then bought out by, I think, Kraft.
Alt Foods.
Oh, excuse me.
No, Alt Foods is my neck of the woods.
Okay,
It's
Alt
where I come
Foods.
from, down
Okay.
east of Winchester, so. Yeah.
Okay, so,
In fact, I used to work for a man at Kraft Foods who was, started as a cheese maker in Balderson.
Oh.
That was his background, so.
you notice they've kept the name too, they on the,
Yeah.
makes you think that it's still.
And Alderson was owned by a group of farmers too.
Yeah. So,
Okay, so Ian, people want to stand up and take a little stretch, or are they planning to go?
And we have the minute books for the Rosebank Cheese Factory, our archives on our college minute books. Claire Sen was the secretary and his mother gave them all to us.
Oh, nice, that's good, it's good to have.
so,
Do you want the lights down again?
I wouldn't mind, please. Thanks, Lord.
Oh, it's behind the what?
I am going to have to sit down because I have a computer that belongs to the Textile Museum that refuses to cooperate with my PowerPoint presentation for whatever reason, and we tried to debug it earlier. So my purpose today is to talk about Alma and Ramsey Dairy, because there was some dairy in Ramsey as well, as you will see later on. And so I started out this venture to talk about dairy, knowing one and only one fact, and that was there used to be a place called Producers Dairy in Alma. So then my second discovery is that there's not an awful lot of material on the internet that helps you along in determining dairy in this part of the country, and probably not in any part of the country for some reason. So I then decided that this was going to have to be more oral history. So I went out and interviewed some people. I have a lot of photos, and so it's mainly photography based, and I will provide some commentary on top of the photography. So that will be the way things go this afternoon. So you have to bear with me while I fight with the computer. And this is a very, yeah. Let's go back again.
Wouldn't recognize that.
the big cheese look like when I went overseas.
So these are two wagons from Strathburn Dairy. Strathburn Dairy was at the corner of Malcolm Street and Strathburn, over by the Glen. And it was started by Rosamond Woolen Mill. That's where that its origin was. And in 1944, it was purchased by George Brown's father. George Brown is one of the people I interviewed, and George is in the audience today, listening to me talk. Strathburn Dairy was quite nice because it had Holsteins and Guernseys. Guernseys are an interesting breed of cow. I will show you a picture of Guernsey later on. Guernseys have a bit more butter fat than Holstein does in its milk, and there are very few Guernseys left in Canada today. I know that 10 years ago there were fewer than 800 Guernseys in the entire countryside. So the count now, I do not know what it is. So I really imagine that it's less than 800. So when I drive around the countryside, I don't really see Guernseys at all. So it's a slightly different wagon. That's a very attractive wagon. And George still has the rubber-tired wagon, and it spends most of its time in parades in Pakenham these days.
It's the last horse-drawn milk wagon used in Almonte.
Yeah.
By Metcalf's Dairy.
Metcalf's area, yeah. So
Those two wagons there, I restored them, the spoke wheel, and I got Mervyn Downey and Larry Cabin and myself and Andy, my brother, and we dug it out of the dump in our farm and brought it home in 2 hay wagons and a manure spreader, and we restored it to that. And I had it quite a while, and I offered it to the museum here because that is originally from Rosamond. That wagon was Rosamond's Dairy, because right across the river, Strathburn Dairy. But nobody had any interest. I wanted to put it in a place where it's high and dry, so I sold it. I had big money for it, and I sold it. And the other wagon, I fixed it up, and I sold it to a guy that had no brains at all. I don't think he was going to deliver milk in Canada. He lasted 2 weeks. So the wagon's sitting down there in the heat. And I have the last wagon I have is Metcalf, so I spent a bit of money on it, but I have lots of fun with it.
at one time, you could actually use tokens, and I believe you could also use paper.
Papers
To
that were used before.
to buy your milk.
The tickets. Those,
So,
they're milk driver on a payday, say from number 1 mill.
yeah,
We had 3 or 4 customers in each route would cash their paycheck, and then they'd buy a week or 2 weeks worth of tickets. The money, the milk's paid for.
yeah.
Lots of people did that. So it worked out well too.
So those are
Those are the Guernsey tickets.
yes, and those are from the North Lanark Regional Museum. So they.
I have 3 of them in my pocket. I always carry them.
Oh, you do you?
Yeah.
You didn't tell me that the day I was out talking to you.
Never has. There, I got that.
No, I didn't ask. So those are slightly different type of token.
That's regular milk,
Okay.
like what we call it plain or Holstein.
So did those just sit in the top of the
Yeah,
bottle?
they can't fall through.
Yeah.
On a
And so
regular-
they put the empty bottle out
Yeah.
for, yeah.
There's the 3 I carried them with me. And another one somewhere.
Neat. So,
Here it is. But we had thousands of these. Oh, there's a Guernsey cow. Is that a red
Guernsey
Holstein?
cow, yeah.
Is that a red Holstein?
No, it's Guernsey. She was in the wrong stall. Her stall actually is the stall that the Holstein is standing in. So this is a photo from the Canada Agriculture and Food Museum. And so I happen to like Guernseys. I think they're a very nice cattle. I never actually worked with them. I just saw them around the countryside. And I did work with Ayrshires. I'll show you a photo of an Ayrshire later.
But the Guernsey and Holstein cow, the attitude is the same. We got along good with both of them.
With both of them?
Pretty sure.
Yeah. Shoot.
We introduced the Guernsey milk in 1946, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was two or 3 cents more than a quart of the regular. And when you come out with that's mid-calf dairy right there.
That is Midcap Dairy, and that building
It's still there.
is still there. I took a photo of it the other day. It's at the corner of Argyle and King Street. And it's currently owned by George Charles.
Yeah.
George used to be one of the owners of the Superior Restaurant. So,
2 milk roads come out of that little building every day.
yeah,
Yep.
amazing, eh?
With Waddle and Gary, what was the Parsons guy's name? 2 of them.
So, okay.
That there's a quart of.
That is Midcap Dairy. Token. Good for homogenized milk. Which I think by implication means it was also pasteurized. So, although I can't guarantee that, but
It's all pasteurized.
all pasteurized, yeah.
That milk I was put through called a homogenizer, and it went, there's no cream line on it, it's all.
Yeah. That is Canadian Hydro Components, which used to be Producer's Dairy. So, and yes, you can still find that in town. Not too difficult to find in town. And one of the gentlemen who is attending today is Pat Muldoon. He's sitting in the back row over there. And Pat Muldoon used to work in Producer's Dairy. So he started off in his teens, and his introduction to life in the Producer's Dairy was that he was shown how to dump milk cans. And they didn't show him how to do it properly. They let him pick up the whole, 116-pound can and dump it. So as the morning went on, he started to wear out, and finally they put Teddy on him and showed him how to do it properly. So, but he also worked on the evaporator, and because they made evaporated milk for different products. Some of their product went to Alt Foods in Winchester, and then and other product went into other dairies. So some of it would have gone to Kraft Foods, some of it would have gone into Ottawa to Seal Test, and I think there was.
I think they shipped to Hershey too.
Shipped to Hershey, yeah. So.
Can I interrupt just for a sec? What was the right way to
You
make
have
the
to, you
can?
just get it out of your knee and your leg, and then you get it down about half, and then you can pick it up. So it was, I didn't think I was gonna make today.
Producers had a can washer, so once you dump the milk, then you place the lid on the can washer, you place the can upside down in the can washer, and then that all ran through, and somebody picked it up at the other end and delivered it where it was supposed to go. So another gentleman who worked at Producer's Dairy is Joe Southwell. And Joe Southwell spent 9 years at the dairy, so he worked on the evaporator originally, and then he worked on maintenance. So he was, and he worked there until it was sold. It was sold to Seal Test, and they changed the name to Almonte Dairy Products. And when it was disassembled, part of it went to Eganville, part of it went to Brockville, part of it went to Alt Foods in Winchester. And hang on one sec. The other person I talked to was Des Giles. And Des Giles worked for 31 years producing butter and Producer's Dairy. So in 1949, he went down to Kemptville, went to Kemptville Agricultural College, and got his certificate for butter making. And so that was paid for by Producer's Dairy. They paid for his course, they paid his room and board, the whole 9 yards, which is pretty impressive in 1949, because I don't think people were all that benevolent necessarily at that time. So, so the milk, that's actually a 3-story building. So, and the milk would have gone in on the ground floor. Butter making was above. And Des started off with a wooden churn, and then eventually worked with a stainless steel churn. They also made condensed milk for Roundtrees, and I found out something about butter that I did not know. And I did not know that when you made butter, there were 2 products that came off of the cream. One is butter, and the other is buttermilk. So he was the fortunate person who advised me where buttermilk comes from. And I happen to like buttermilk. I haven't had any for years because I don't really drink milk anymore. Maybe the odd glass of wine. So again, the Producers was dependent on steam. They were dependent on steam for pasteurizing, and dependent on steam for the evaporator. And the evaporator would be somewhat like a boiler, and it would have tubes in it, so milk would flow through the evaporator and gradually get reduced either to evaporated milk or powder. So okay.
Ian, can I just ask, what about creameries? Was the creamery, did they only take cream?
No.
Or what was the difference between dairy and?
Creamery, they took your separated milk as cream, and they took it, I remember the guy from Clayton there drove got 5-gallon cans of cream and took them to Mississippi Creamery.
And then milk would have gone to
Oh, we skim milk
producers.
guy.
Oh, that's it.
This old guy chewed tobacco, the butter maker, and he tasted the milk and let her go. Because my father, we had lots of excess cream, and we'd either take it or I think the guy's name used to pick it up. But anyway, I often was there. The building's still there.
Where is it?
Where?
Yeah.
Across the bridge on the right. behind that old hotel.
Coleman Street, right? Coleman Street.
Yeah, Todd Coleman. McMurray was the driver, remember? He lived out by the old tannery there.
Yeah, so Des had a couple of magazines that he showed me, and one of them had the essential creamery package for making butter. So it was kind of an interesting beast. I had no experience with butter milking, butter making until I started talking to him. So. And this would happen to be a photo of his certificate. So,
I got one of those at home for my father. He got his in Guelph. He got butter maker, cheese maker, and
yeah,
there was 3 of them.
3 of them.
I have the 3 of them at home,
So, and that didn't come out too badly, seeing as I took it through glass, which is probably not the best idea I ever had in my life.
yeah. The class 4 engineer, stationary engineer certificate.
Always got a class 4, did he?
Yeah, went with that.
Yeah. So this is courtesy of George, and so of course it notes the Strathburn Dairy at the top. So the interesting thing about this is that there actually was a fair amount of dairy that was actually going on in Almonte Ramsey. And contrary to the one location that I thought was applicable, there was quite a lot going on. So Tosh would have been out by
Straight across, just up the road there.
on Martin Street.
He owned Deco Dairy. He bought it from, I have the bottle at home. It's on,
So that was out by Sunburst.
just on the Clayton Road, first farm on the right.
Okay.
For every minute. That was the guy that, R.J. Moyer.
R.J. Moyer.
Something like that.
So.
I have a ticket, a token and a bottle from that farm.
So George has quite a number of artifacts out of his place, actually.
small collection.
So, which are all interesting.
I got Peterson's, I picked up a quart of bowling pin style with Peterson on it, and I have never seen another one around. And I have 2 pints. There's a guy in Oshawa phoned me wanting to buy the quart body. He collects ice cream stuff. And I said, not for sale, because I can't find another one. He's phoned me about 3 times. See, Peterson's used to own the Superior restaurant in Almonte, and Louis and his brother, Louis Peterson, and his brother, I don't know his name, they sold it to the Scott boys in the late 40s, Eddie and Denny Scott. But while Louis owned it, he sold chocolate drink. Not chocolate. There isn't such a thing as chocolate milk, it's chocolate drink.
You have all been informed. I was informed the other day that I had used terminology wrong for over 69 years. But I now call it chocolate drink. So,
Well, on the milk caps it had, I remember, who was it? They had chocolate milk instead of chocolate drink on the caps.
yeah.
For the chocolate.
Yeah. So,
Can you go back 1 picture?
sure can.
All right, down at the bottom of that, it's, no, is that the one that's already dairy?
Oh, hang on. While I fight with this.
Keep going.
That's what you're looking for?
You know anything about that, Ray Dairy and
Ray Dairy, yeah.
I know nothing about Ray Dairy.
Your brother was there? Rayside Road. That old wagon that I fixed up, I brought it home from the dump, and I had raised dairy on the side, painted over to Strathburn. Mary on one side and Mary A on the other side.
Just like both sides.
And then that wagon went from Ray's to where Boyd Jemison lived. They had models.
So another dairy type business in Almonte would have been Peterson's Ice Cream. So, and I didn't think about that when I started this, and then gradually I came to the realization that that ice cream has some dairy component to it. So,
Well, they had 2 or 3 patrons, Naismith and Sid Moore, and who's that one?
Sid Moore.
Well, Sid Moore's father.
Sid Moore's father.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and the other thing here is Stewart Milk Transport, which was around here from the time when they were trucking cans, and then they graduated to bulk tanks and transports. And I believe they were bought out by Villeneuve from Moose
Yeah.
Creek. And then I believe Villeneuve has since been bought out, so
No, he's part of it.
he's part of it?
Just, no, he didn't sell the whole thing, he sold part of it.
He sold part of it.
Was
Yeah.
it called Blue something?
Blue water.
Blue Water. So I remember, I certainly remember Bernie Villeneuve, because he used to come into Kraft Foods where I worked, delivering milk, and I worked one summer on the intake at Kraft. So so I got to know a fair number of people who were hauling milk. So
Ian, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
These different farms that like Ray Dairy and somebody that have dairy, were they selling milk themselves with their wagons to
Yeah.
customers? So their milk,
They all went out of business when pasteurization came in.
oh, okay,
And there were 2 left, was Metcalf's. and,
Oh, okay. But before that,
Anybody could have done it.
anybody could just go,
Taking Clayton, Jack Virgin's grandfather, he sold milk in the village out of a can. And then I found out the other day, an Armstrong guy from Kinburn, Wally's, anyway, his grandfather sold milk in Kinburn out of a can.
whatever we can.
To door to door.
Sims and Ian Opton did the same thing.
so they would
Once
just
a day,
take these, they would just take these big cans of milk and dip out what people wanted?
8-gallon cans, sure.
Huh.
So,
That was when your stomach had microbes.
That's right.
my mother was a public health nurse, and she was appalled to find out one day that I had been drinking out of a bulk tank that contained Jersey milk.
That's why you're so big.
So, and then when I worked for Kraft, of course, we would drink raw milk at Kraft as well, just nice and cold right off the truck. So
We used to have a Presbyterian minister here, could drink nothing but raw milk or he'd break out in a rash. So we always kept the quart of milk on the shelf with an X on it. One day he drove in, no X on it. We just took a quart of milk and shook it up, put an X in it for 30 years.
so
And Jimmy MacLean, he had a bake shop in Almonte. And when my father went from glass bottles to paper cartons,
yeah.
his bread wouldn't rise for him or something. So we always took milk and tin and poured the milk out of a paper carton into a bottle and give it to everybody's house.
Okay. That is a photo of a Holstein, and the photo is from the Lowry Farm on County Road 29, just outside of Almonte. And I was given a fine tour out there along with Pat Muldoon one morning, and saw how this is called a freestyle barn. So, and I will show you the tie style barn after. And I could not find a photo of a stanchion barn, which is stanchion barn in Quebec probably to the 60s and before.
In here,
Well, you've got one.
and the old kind with the veil stick on the side.
I should have called you.
Really milking, huh?
5, 6, 7.
Yeah, that's just another photo of Lowry's barn. Again, you can see that nobody is tied up, so there's no restriction on their movement within the barn. They have to stay within the barn, obviously. And this is a rather interesting piece of equipment. This is very modern, very high-tech. It's something that I had never seen one like that. I had been in a 250 head freestall barn that had 3 milking parlors in it. That's a number of years ago. I was in it just after it was built. But this is, what you're looking at here is you're looking at a robotic arm. And the robotic arm does a number of things. First of all, it cleans the udder, it dries the udder, and then it places the suction cups on the udder. And then you see the 4 hoses that are leading off from the machine. And the 4 hoses lead over to a place where the milk is weighed, and then it goes from there to the bulk tank. So one of the cows is currently going through the milking parlor 4 times a day. Some of them do 3 times a day, some maybe 2 times a day. So, it really is quite an operation when you get right down to it, so, in my opinion.
So is the cow, the ones that are going more often just want more food? Or they,
As their milk production goes up, it's for comfort,
Okay.
plus they get fed more too, so.
Yeah. So, this is a slightly different kind of barn. This is at the Canada Agriculture and Food Museum, and that is their dry cow barn. So, agriculture and food normally milks 51 head, and so this is where their dry cows are, except at this time of the year the dry cows are out in the field having a good time. This barn was renovated as one of my projects when I worked for Science and Tech Museum. And pardon me for 1 sec here. The project was done by Larry Gaines, who is an architect that operates out of the Almonte Old Town Hall. And I think I've known Larry for, I'm going to say, well over 20 years. So I've done a number of projects with him. And one of the things that's interesting in this barn is that Larry and I spent an afternoon, part of an afternoon, to scrape paint and come up with the original paint color that was used in that main dairy barn back when it was built. So it is now, that is paint that is comparable to the original paint that was used in that barn. So I think that's kind of neat.
What year would you suggest that that beige paint was used?
I'm going to say 1910. Yeah. Probably 1910. So,
Two draw a picture of that.
sorry? I know you don't like airshirts. I like airshirts. So, and so I worked when I was in my early teens. I farmer who had air sharks.
Is that an air shark?
Yeah. I don't agree with the color on it.
No.
It's labeled as an air shark. So, but the farmer I worked for actually came from Ayrshire in Scotland. He came from Ayr, and he was a home child. So he came to Canada in the 1930s through a social agency called Quarriers Homes. And and he ended up in Finch, Ontario, and he farmed there until he retired. So he was well looked after by the owners, and did extremely well for himself. So that is purported to be an Ayrshire cat. Okay, and like I don't like the color, but that's what they're calling it. So.
Can I ask you a stupid question?
No questions, Stephen.
Why do we not like the color?
It's not red enough.
Not red
Are
enough?
they done by a tattoo or a picture?
Well, I was just gonna say,
Personal
it used to be, when you registered it, if it's a purebred, and you registered it, you'd have to draw a picture. And then they from product forward, we can use a camera, you take a picture of it. So you can imagine sitting down and trying to draw this in a camera.
Are Ayrshires done by picture or tattoo?
I don't know. Jerseys are done with tattoo.
Guernseys are tattoo.
So an air shark, you know, you can get a red bull, so you can get a black air shark.
The black
Is
Ayrshire.
that maybe what's happened there?
Nothing about
There's your Joyce's. Jesus, they're going long man chain on them.
It always looks like little
Yeah.
That's because it don't feed them, they can reach right over the wall.
Yeah.
blue eyes.
So that is a Jersey cow, and it's in a Textile barn. And so their freedom is restricted in Textile, but they in the summertime, in the spring and fall, they get to go out every night, spend some time in the field. But when they're in the barn, they've got more freedom than they would have if they were in a stanchion, where a stanchion would be basically be holding both sides of their neck and preventing them from backing out. So that would be the way they would spend a day, was in the stanchion. So the freestyle gives them more flexibility. So.
Can I add something here?
Yep.
We had a like a chain system in our own barn.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of movement. Our stalls were fairly wide and fairly long,
Yeah.
and we had a lot of movement. When we let them out in the spring, they didn't lay down in the grass. So after the switch rip around, like that would be down. The milk production fell because of the heat and so you think it's terrible having to tie it up, but the cows didn't respond negatively to it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. So. No, I quite like the freestyle barn because I like the flexibility of movement that they have, and basically.
What you're showing us there is a tie stall, not a freestall.
No, that was a tie stall there. That's correct. Yeah. So that was actually another one of my projects at the Agriculture Museum was changing the nature of the tie stall barn, and what we did is we raised the manger for them, and we raised the bar that they're tied to. So again, so they could fit their head under that bar easier. And we put in high flow water bowls so that when they decided to have a drink of water, they never ran out of water. Because apparently if they run out of water, then they stop drinking. And if they stop drinking, then that affects milk production. So
the theory is once they start sucking air, Yeah, the air replaces the water, but the air doesn't make milk, so
Yeah,
that's why.
that's why, yeah. So, the evolution of dairy in Almonte is a thing called a distillery. And so the distillery is quite interesting because it's using byproducts called unused milk sugar, and they're making vodka out of it. So, and apparently at one point in time, a lot of this was actually going as waste, and now it's no longer waste. So the product comes from Parmalat in Winchester, and it's trucked up here, and they offload it and store it. So
Did you know there's one of those distilleries in Indiana, Wisconsin?
in Wisconsin, no.
So TV,
Okay, no, I was not aware of that. So,
they showed a bunch of Holstein heifers that got loose. They're doing a home show around the building.
yeah,
And they showed the distillery.
okay.
It's called vodka.
So,
The copy in this,
Eh?
the copy in Canada.
so that is a photo of their building. They kindly supplied me with a photo of the interior of the building. And that shows their the fractionating column that is used to distill. And I'm sorry, I can't shrink it, but you can go out there and you can get a tour anytime you want, anytime they're open. They'll give you a tour of the distillery part, which is quite interesting, I might add. So, and I do not like vodka. I do not like vodka. Not gonna happen. So, the day they start making scotch out of milk sugar, I probably will do something about that. So, I have some acknowledgements that I have to make because I did spend time with Des Giles, talking to him, and it was quite informative. Joe Southwell I also know from the Almonte Curling Club, so I bought him a cup of coffee up at the new coffee place on Mill Street, and so we had a nice chat. George Brown, I spent about an hour and a half at George's place talking to him, looking at his artifacts.
See, you got off lucky.
I wasn't in a hurry that day.
So, and then of course, Alan and Brad Laurie with their dairy barn, and thank you very much for that. Also, I have to thank Canada Agriculture and Food Museum because they allowed me to take photos. They have a policy about taking photos, so as long as I did not include a visitor or one of their employees in the photo, then I was good to go. And last but not least, Pat Muldoon, who is here today.
Who's the manager of producers? The old guy showed it all the time.
Tenant,
Archie.
when I was there, it was Enoch
Oh,
Tenant.
no, this is the old guy doing the big Buick.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Ken,
Yeah,
Jesus, you could hear him.
yeah, and then Donnie Smith came in.
Just shouting and roaring and going.
What's that?
Archibald.
Yes, yes.
That's that guy.
Yeah, in actual fact, this presentation would not have happened if I had not been at Almonte Fitness and seated next to Pat Muldoon, who overheard me talking about Producers Dairy and stopped me on the way out and asked me what I was doing. So after I told him, amazingly enough, all these people seem to come out of the woodwork, and he helped arrange meetings with people, and he of course shared his own experience and working at Producers Dairy. So, thank you, Pat.
And I worked there 2 summers. I was still going to high school.
Okay, still going to high school, yeah. So, and that is my presentation today. Thank you.
You folks remember Will Snedden's drugstore?
Yep.
When my folks moved to Almonte in August of 1944, they went down to the lawyer with Sandy Forsyth, the owner, and got her all signed up. They were back at home. The phone rang, and Sandy says, "You answered, you own it. And here was Will Snedden wanting 2 quarts of milk for his ice cream party." He was our first customer.
So, yeah. I don't know, do you have any questions, or?
Across the street from the Agriculture Museum in the experimental farm, across the driveway is building 57. And it's 2 buildings, one from the 1950s and then the old one from like 1912 or 13.
Yeah.
And in that original little wooden house was groundbreaking Canadian research in dairy technology. I worked on the design and the restoration of both of those buildings. And in back of that building is an old ice house. And it had 2 or 3 foot thick walls filled with straw in the summer. And they would store ice in there so that they had ice to use over the course of the winter, over the course of the summer. And then we redesigned that to turn it into a conference room and meeting facility, and kept all of the old ice house walls and stuff inside. It's really beautiful. You can't go into it, it's closed to the public, but it's really
No, I've never been in building 57. I've only been, all the agriculture museum buildings I know very, very well. But were you with KWC Architects?
Yeah, at the time, back in the day.
Back in the day? Okay.
Back in my youth.
Misspent?
It didn't seem that there were many pictures of Producers Dairy around, because I was trying to, I did the dairy history for our Women's Institute teacher book. I had a hard time even finding one picture of a farmer loading cans on a Producer Dairy truck.
I have a picture. I have a picture somewhere in Maryland with the old Frontenac, the guy that soldier.
Yeah,
Producers had it, that was their symbol.
yeah,
I had one somewhere with it, it was on the front of
yeah.
there.
Dennis thought he had some, but he couldn't track them down. Because we talked with them, I asked him about some pictures and he couldn't.
Yeah, because the working,
Yeah.
buildings and that, nobody ever bothered to take pictures.
Remember, producers used to put the skim milk in Gordon Elliott would drive it, bring it over and run it off in the pasture and the grass would grow.
Yeah.
But they used to dump it in the river and they couldn't get stopped doing that.
Yes.
The Delaware guy from Appleton was also right.
Yeah, that would.
Yeah. He, similar to Stewart.
But Gordon Elliott drove for Sparks and then.
Yeah, Judy Sparks, they used to pick up, yeah.
That little short pup trailer.
That's right.
Jesus, they'd come loaded heavy across the bridge. I don't know.
But the Rosebank Cheese Factory, nobody's ever taken a picture of it that I've ever seen, and it was a wooden building that was moved from Pakenham.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Cox was the cheesemaker apparently, and he moved this whole big building up. And then it became a dance hall for 3 or 4 years in the 50s. Non-host dance hall until it burned down. That was maybe one of those convenient fires, I don't know.
Is this the one in Wakeman?
Yeah.
I saw a picture of somewhere he owns where they're bringing the milk to the factory in cans. Like it's
For
fixed
sale.
house or something.
The picture's for sale.
But and I've commented to my family, there wasn't a tree in sight. Not a tree for miles. I guess that was the day when everything was used for firewood.
Yeah, Earl and Sandy used to get 5 cents a car to park the cars at the dance hall, and there's a rocky pasture field. I think some people might have lost their radiators.
Where were you then? Where were you then?
That's before my time.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Well, I
somebody,
remember when your father used to bring two or three cans of milk to our place in the back of the front car.
Yes.
He had a blank across there, no car up like this one.
Well, that's the other story. When people think that the milk marketing board, well, the dairy farmers, maybe not George, but most dairy, anybody in Guernsey's didn't like it. But when the milk marketing board came in, before that, it was, if you didn't live near of town, you really got paid low for your milk. So some of us shipped it to North Bay, but in order to do that, you had to catch the train. I had to go out with my father, I remember, it wasn't very old, and you put 2 cans in the back of the car, and it was at midnight, so you had to go to the station and grab the big lantern and run out in the track and swing it, and this huge train stops, and you load your 2 cans of milk, and it goes on all that way to North Bay, and that's where the term milk run comes from. It was really a slow trip, I'm sure, but you got a few extra cents for your milk, so that's what you did.
I remember there's 2 or 3 guys who come in a big black car from the Ontario Dairy Commission, whatever that was. And they tell you when you go do this, my mother just boiled over when they drive in, telling us how to do our, and you get a cent raise, your price up in your a quart of milk, a cent or 2, you had to go through this commission.
If I could just ask, this picture of the, on the back of this cheese factory, I got this picture at the Middleville Museum, and it was labeled Rosebank Cheese Factory, but Marilyn doesn't recognize it at all, and I was wondering if there's anybody else who might have seen it. I haven't put the title on there because if I don't know it's right, I'm not going to, but doesn't look familiar. Okay, when you said there's a tree in sight, there's not a tree in sight for that one.
Well, I just think Alan's grandmother was the one that taught or collected all the early history, and if there had been a photo, it would have been there, but I've never seen one.
Well, I come across over here, but it seems to me it was a paper, something in the Gazette. Think of the past that was in the Gazette.
Just let me know when you.
I may have the wrong, cheese factory, but there's no trees in it.
We had a hired man, Huey MacLean. He was there 40-some years on our farm, and he had a history and knowledge of everything. He's passed now, but you could talk to him for hours. I got all kinds of stuff. I wrote it down.
You're writing some of this down.
Now I can't find it.
No.
And then we had another guy, Bob Young. They came with the farm, and 2 other guys, and Bob did the one milk crate.
And the horse knew where to
Oh,
stop.
jeez. We used to have 2 horses at one time, and then the milk was delivered in the afternoon, and for about 3 or 4 years, and then we went to the mornings. That was a terrible thing, but it was better for get her done. And in the end, we had 2 horses on a truck, and we ended up with 3 trucks. Horses were hard to find.
How many years for these?
Trucks are more difficult to train.
How many years have you been staffing
Since 1944,
until?
they quit production, pasteurizing milk in 1961. And they shipped us over to our dairy in Ottawa, brought it back there, product and so on.
So you lived there? Did you know people on Malcolm Street? Did you know the Lee sisters? Lee, L-E-E.